I am a grateful and enthusiastic member of the anniversary of Codependents Anonymous. I am codependent as hell, and my name is Ritchard. I am joining you today from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada, where my home group is the Experience, Strength, and Hope group. I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time giving you my backstory. So, bottom line is my life was not going well. I walked into my first CoDA meeting the first Monday after Mother's Day 17 years ago, and my life was pretty much burnt to the ground. I met some terrifying women who made some suggestions, and I followed those suggestions. Things are going a lot better now. When we do a workshop, I typically have some goals in mind. My wife yesterday said to me something that she says periodically. She said, I had a thought I've never thunk before. I said, oh, what was that? And she told me her idea. It was a great idea. I think we're actually going to be able to do something with it. And that's the name of the game for me with a workshop, is that I'm hoping that some of you come away from this having a thought that you've never thunk before. That if I can today introduce even just a handful of you to a new thought or a new perspective that you can use in your own recovery, I'll consider the day a success. Now, the way I like to do this kind of thing is as a roundtable discussion format, in person, where people raise their hands around the table and we invite them into the discussion, and it's the kind of environment where crosstalk's not only allowed, it's encouraged, because it's an exchange of ideas. And that's a little difficult to navigate in the Zoom environment, but we're going to give that a shot. As Christina said, if you'd like to participate in the discussion, please raise your hand, and don't be shy about when you do that. I am going to point out that this is not a meeting. Even when we do it in person, what I stress to people is that what we're not going to do is we're not going to, take turns going around the table, listening respectfully while people take their 3 to 5 minutes to share their experience, strength, and hope. I hope we move a little faster than that. So please, the 3 to 5 minute thing, I would ask you to be a little more concise than that, even if you could. We have a lot of material to go through. We're going to try to do a couple of breaks, and if you end up needing a break before I do, maybe send one of the co-hosts a message, and we'll see if we can navigate that. So what we're going to talk about here today is the 12 promises of Codependents Anonymous. I can expect a miraculous change in my life by working the program of Codependents Anonymous as I make an honest effort to work the 12 steps and follow the 12 traditions. 1, I know a new sense of belonging. The feelings of emptiness and loneliness will disappear. 2, I'm no longer controlled by my fears. I overcome my fears and act with courage, integrity, and dignity. And 3, I know a new freedom. 4, I release myself from worry, guilt, and regret about my past and present. I'm aware enough not to repeat it. 5, I know a new love and acceptance of myself and others. I feel genuinely lovable, loving, and loved. 6, I learn to see myself as equal to others. My new and renewed relationships are all with equal partners. 7, I'm capable of developing and maintaining healthy and loving relationships. The need to control and manipulate others will disappear as I learn to trust those who are trustworthy. 8, I learned that it is possible for me to mend, to become more loving, intimate, and supportive. I have the choice of communication with my family in a way which is safe for me and respectful of them. 9, I acknowledge that I am a unique and precious creation. 10, I no longer need to rely solely on others to provide my sense of worth. 11, I trust the guidance I receive from my higher power and come to believe in my own capabilities. And 12, I gradually experience serenity, strength, and spiritual growth in my daily life. I want to tell you that the content we're going to talk about today comes primarily out of some workshops that we did here in Saskatoon and also in Winnipeg, Canada, over the last 7 years or so, and has kind of been collected and collated, and we're collaborating on a booklet on the the 12 promises, and that's going to serve as the bones for what we're going to do here today. So as we go along, what I'm going to do is read a section from the draft of that booklet, and then we'll take a little bit of time to discuss what we've just heard. So I hope everybody's on side with that. I can't see too many nodding heads because I'm screen sharing, but I'm going to carry on that basis. So the 12 promises of Codependents Anonymous. Remember the first time we heard that? For a lot of us, the first time we heard it was in a CoDA meeting. Others may have found the promises when we stumbled across a CoDA website, or a friend may have shared them with us to let us know that what they had found in CoDA. Wherever we heard these 12 remarkable statements for the first time, most of us had a visceral reaction to them. Some of us found hope. Maybe this is possible for me too. Others may have been skeptical. These promises are nonsense. I'm far too damaged. This could never happen for me. Whatever our reactions, we came back to CoDA meetings and applied the program to our lives. We began to experience some or all of the CoDA promises. For some of us, they've come gradually, growing little by little over a period of time. Others of us have experienced them suddenly. We awoke one day to the realization that we feel different, that we are experiencing freedom and exhibiting an integrity and dignity that we've never had before. Often, it's only after we see these changes in other CoDA members that we notice them in ourselves, and we realize that we've changed in the very same ways. The one constant that we see is that CoDA members who actively work the 12 steps and apply themselves to practicing the 12 traditions do see the promises fulfilled in their lives. So the purpose of this workshop today is to explore the 12 promises. We're going to talk about not only how many of us experience the promises in our lives, but also how we can use them as actual hands-on tools to further our recovery. You know, it starts even before we start reading the promises. A little introduction to the promises. There's a 13th promise there. That idea that I can expect a miraculous change in my life. That's a promise. How? By working the program of Codependents Anonymous. By working the steps and practicing the traditions, I have had a miraculous change in my life. Today, I can tell you that every single one of these promises has come true in my life to one degree or another, with varying degrees of consistency. We'll talk about progress, not perfection, a little later. In the meantime, what about you guys? How did you feel the first time that you heard these promises? And how do you experience them? How do you first notice them coming true in your life? So let's have a look at that. Promise 1. I know a new sense of belonging. The feelings of emptiness and loneliness will disappear. Many CoDA members describe intense feelings, sometimes lifelong ones, of alienation. Some talk about feeling as if they were dropped off as babies by aliens. Others talk about feeling lonely, separate, different, and afraid. Still others describe the inability to feel loved or feel valued, even when they know intellectually that they are loved and valued. These feelings often provoke a sense of emptiness and a profound loneliness that follows codependents throughout their lives. These feelings may be the prime motivator for many of the patterns and characteristics of codependence. CoDA's Promise 1 suggests that we will recover from these feelings and enjoy a new sense of belonging. Often, this is the first promise we experience, sometimes at our very first meeting. The warm welcome and unconditional acceptance we experience as newcomers can sometimes penetrate our misery and our denial to suggest to us that we've finally found some place to belong. For some, the sense of belonging becomes even more concrete when we get involved in CoDA service, whether at the group, intergroup, voting entity, or conference level. Service work provides us the opportunity to connect with other recovering codependents in a new and vital way. For many, this sense of belonging is also enhanced by sponsorship. We experience the love and acceptance that our sponsor has provided us. Then we consider the love we feel for a sponsee who has placed their trust in us, and the satisfaction we see from that sponsee's growth. In the midst of these considerations, it's easy to feel that we are a part of a greater whole, a chain of recovery in which we are a single link or a river in which we are part of the flow. We realize that we are part of something bigger than ourselves. Isn't it interesting when they worded Promise 1 that they talked about the feelings of emptiness and loneliness? They didn't say any feelings of emptiness and loneliness that we might have. They're assuming that if you're in a meeting of Codependents Anonymous, you know the feelings of emptiness and loneliness. Does that resonate with anybody? Yeah, you know, they draw a direct connection in this promise between that sense of belonging and those feelings of emptiness and loneliness. That feeling of lonely, separate, different, and afraid. And you know, I knew that all my life, but I also hear it again and again from speakers from the podium in other fellowships. You know, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous. And you know, what I've learned in CoDA is that it's that feeling of lonely, separate, different, and afraid seems to be at the root of all of these problems. I just characterize that as the spiritual malady. Learned here that what happens is it demands to be medicated. And you know, an alcoholic is somebody apparently who is lucky enough to be able to medicate that feeling by taking a drink. They take a drink and that feeling goes away for a little while. I can't do that. It doesn't work for me. I spent my life as an addict in search of a drug that would work for me. And what worked best, longest for me was relationships and workaholism. And I ended up in Codependents Anonymous instead of AA. Thanks everybody for so far. We're going to need to move on to Promise 2. Promise 2 says, I am no longer controlled by my fears. I overcome my fears and act with courage, integrity, and dignity. Promise 2 is built on an assumption that some of us have resisted as newcomers, that codependence is an illness built on fear. As we progress in our recovery, we learn how true that assumption is. We learn that in the midst of our illness, we are always afraid of someone or for someone. We learn that fear is the bedrock on which our codependent patterns are based. In step 4, we examine our fears. We might find that we are afraid of criticism or other people's anger. Maybe we're afraid of ridicule. We may be afraid of excessive attention or, ironically, of being ignored. Ultimately, we may realize that all of these stem from 2 core fears: rejection and abandonment. We're afraid that others won't accept us, or that having appeared to accept us, they will now reject us. We also realize that these fears are founded on a lack of self-esteem. We don't consider ourselves worthy, so we naturally conclude that others see us the same way. In the process of working the steps, we face our fears and ask a loving higher power to release us from them. We gain self-esteem by performing esteem-worthy acts. The traditions guide us in dealing with others from a place of equality and self-respect. As we practice these new behaviors, we notice that less and less of our actions are being driven by our fears. At first, these new behaviors may feel wrong. We may even feel fake. I'm not courageous or dignified, we may think. I have no integrity. But our sponsors guide us in applying the recovery tool of acting as if. We act as if when we do the things that a courageous person would do, even if it terrifies us. We act as if when we do the things a person of integrity and dignity would do. And as we practice these new behaviors, as our fears loosen their grip on us, acts of courage, integrity, and dignity gradually begin to feel more natural to us. What are these fears that they're talking about that need to be overcome? You think about the stories that we hear in our rooms. I mean, how much of our codependent behavior is based on trauma-informed fear? Integrity, I've heard suggested, is what we sometimes hear described as program honesty. The idea that my words and my actions agree with each other, that I do what I say and I say what I mean. And another way that I think dovetails with what we just heard is say what you mean what you say, but don't say it mean. That idea of the motives matter in that equation. What does dignity look like? Let's move on to promise 3. I know a new freedom. What exactly does a new freedom mean to us? Freedom from what? For some, it's freedom from the fears that we described in our 4th step inventory. For others, it is freedom from expectations by ourselves or others. It might be freedom from the control of someone else's personality or from our own compulsions. For some of us, it is the freedom to finally be ourselves. Prior to recovery, many codependents describe the grip of their codependent patterns by saying, I had no choice. The program tells us that we always have choices. Our sponsor helps us to see those choices, and our higher power supports us in them. Once we've accepted life on life's terms, we've worked through that things have been blocking us from our higher power, through the things that have been blocking us from higher power. I just found a typo. Our choices expand. We begin to see the hand of a higher power in our lives, and we find the freedom to act on the will of that higher power rather than being trapped in our old ways. So, what is it that you're looking for freedom from? Promise 4. I release myself from worry, guilt, and regret about my past and present. I'm aware enough not to repeat it. Some codependents arrive in Codependents Anonymous mired in worry, guilt, and regret, paralyzed by shame. The CoDA literature helps us to understand the dynamics of the shame we've carried. Then our sponsor and our CoDA friends help us to see our lives from a different perspective. We learn the difference between acceptance and resignation. We accept that the events of the past actually happened and that we don't have the ability to go back and change them. We accept today's situation as reality rather than fighting it with the wishful thinking that we learn is called denial. Acceptance of the facts of our past and present finally allows us to explore our options and take different actions. We apply ourselves to the program. In working the steps, particularly steps 4 through 9, we learn to see the difference between shame and our earned guilt. Reliance on a higher power rather than on others releases us from our shame, and we make amends to discharge ourselves of our earned guilt. Having accepted our mistakes and made amends to put things right where we could, we find that we no longer have to carry the burden of worry, guilt, and regret. We can walk the earth as free men and women without the constant fear of our past codependent patterns. So, have you been able to disarm your shame? Have you accepted your past, and can you look back without staring? Does anyone in your life have the ability to improve your past? How about your present or future? Thank you, Julia. We're going to need to move on to Promise 5, which says, I know a new love and acceptance of myself and others. I feel genuinely lovable, loving, and loved. For many of us, the core of our codependency is that we never felt lovable, loving, and loved. The desperate desire to feel loved, to belong, harmed our self-esteem and led us to compliant behaviors that further damaged our already low self-esteem. The fear of rejection and abandonment fueled our attempts to control others. Our fear of being hurt drove us to practice avoidance. In CoDA, we met fellow members who were committed to loving us until we could love ourselves. They modeled unconditional love for us and supported and applauded our efforts to behave in loving ways. One day, perhaps out of the blue, the thought may occur to us, these people and my higher power love me, therefore I must be lovable. The logic is irrefutable. Working the steps allows us to engage in esteemable acts, and we slowly build self-esteem. Eventually, we may suddenly realize that we like ourselves, we respect ourselves, we even love ourselves. We realize that we love these people in our groups and others in our lives, and we learn new ways to express that love. We stop confusing love with approval or sex and find that once we love ourselves, we can be loving toward even the difficult people in our lives. So for me, like I said before, I cried in every meeting for the first 6 months, and nobody made fun of me. Nobody kicked me out for being disruptive. They just loved me until that little chink in the armor showed up, and I realized that if they love me, I must be lovable. So how has your definition of love changed in recovery? And how do we express this new love and acceptance in our lives? And How does our behavior change when we feel genuinely lovable, loving, and loved? Would anybody like to address one of those? Thanks, Lucas, and we're going to have to move on to Promise 6, which says, I learned to see myself as equal to others. My new and renewed relationships are all with equal partners. Ladder thinking is a hallmark of the disease of codependence. Most of us saw the people around us as above us and to be obeyed, or as beneath us and to be fixed or saved. In many of our relationships, we were dependent on the approval of others, and our relationships were automatically out of balance. Dependence on external approval meant that we would hand all of our power to anyone that asked for it, or seemed to ask for it, or might ask for it. Since nobody respects a doormat, our self-esteem plummeted. In our relationships, we may have seen the other person not as a person, but as a locus for problems we could solve. We reasoned that if they were such a mess, the noble thing to do, and we thought we were so very noble, was to step in and fix the problem for them. At first, they were often grateful, and we gained a temporary boost to our ego. But in solving their problems, we took control, or the illusion of control, of a swath of the other person's life. We had to. We were much more qualified to be in charge than they were. If and when the other person realized how we viewed them, they may have been hurt or offended. In CoDA, the 12 steps cultivate humility in us. Humility is not humiliation, but rather a proportionate and realistic view of ourselves with respect to others. We learn to identify, don't compare. The 12 traditions teach us that the only person responsible for solving another's problems is them. That's tradition 7. We learn to see where we stop and another person begins. Tradition 4. Most of all, we learn that we are all equal. Tradition 2. Without the pressure to jockey for position on an imaginary ladder, we are free to be ourselves. We learn to relate to others exactly where they are, and they do the same with us. So, have you engaged in ladder thinking? What does an equal partnership mean to you? Does everything have to be 50-50? How does tradition 6 apply to equal partners? I can tell you that I was never interested in equality. It's I want to be in charge completely, or I want you to be in charge so I can blame you when it goes wrong. That's my modus operandi. So, Promise 7 says, I'm capable of developing and maintaining healthy and loving relationships. The need to control and manipulate others will disappear as I learn to trust those who are trustworthy. Many of us discovered at an early age that trusting others often resulted in pain or disappointment. Growing up in a dysfunctional family system is inherently unstable and unpredictable. We learned that asking for what we want and need in a straightforward manner gave others the power to hurt us. In reaction, we learned to apply methods of control or manipulation to get our needs met. Over time, our patterns of control and manipulation inevitably drove others away. In CoDA, we were asked to consider the real source of the problem. Was it that other people are universally untrustworthy, or were we perhaps surrounded by and attracted to people who were untrustworthy? Were we trusting too much, or were we simply trusting the wrong people? CoDA introduces us to relationships with sponsors and other recovery friends who are there for us, friends who go to great lengths to be there for us and to offer us a safe, respectful environment. These are friends who are trying to live a life of honesty and authenticity. They're not perfect, but they try to say what they mean and do what they say. Slowly, perhaps, it dawns on us that we're not obligated to trust those who have proven themselves untrustworthy, but that there are at least a few trustworthy people in the world. Perhaps some of the trustworthy people were there in our lives all the time. We couldn't see them because we were so focused on the untrustworthy ones. But now we are free to offer at least a little bit of trust to someone that won't betray us. The little bit of trust that we've cultivated grows, and we are able to use it as the cornerstone for a new kind of relationship. We begin to experience relationships based on mutual trust and respect. We learn that the only healthy love, the only reliable love, is unconditional love. So we stop putting our trust in those who put a price tag on love. We become more trustworthy ourselves as we grow. We become more open and honest with people that have been open and honest with us. We begin to enjoy real intimacy with others without exposing our vulnerabilities to those who don't deserve it. We begin to enjoy real, healthy, and loving relationships. And
Richard, we need you to share your screen again.
Just
there
on
you
it.
go. Perfect.
Okay, so and we probably need to get onto the right page. So how do we learn to trust? How does the ability to trust improve our relationships? And how do we relate to those who might not be trustworthy? I can tell you that I spent most of my life working this backwards. You know, the difficult people, as I refer to them in my life, seem to have a knack for getting me to trust them. And it was because they had this magic technique that all they had to do was say one simple sentence, and I would trust them implicitly. They would say to me, "Don't you trust me?" Well, now I've got to trust them, because otherwise they might not like me. Yeah, and that was the story of my life. Thanks, Adam. That brings up a point of question that I really should have had on this particular page. How do we spot trustworthy people? How do we spot untrustworthy people? Well, watch their hands, not their mouths. Watch their actions, not their words. Okay, with that, we have to move on to 8. I misspoke earlier. And 8 says, I learned that it is possible for me to mend, to become more loving, intimate, and supportive. I have the choice of communication with my family in a way which is safe for me and respectful of them. Codependence kills communication. Driven by self-centered fear, some of us have been constantly on our guard in communicating with those around us. In the past, when we've let our guard down, we've been misunderstood or misquoted or mischaracterized. We've been hurt. Often we've responded to the hurt by redoubling our guard and either walking on eggshells or shutting down. Eventually, the pressure of stuffing our feelings would build to the point that we could no longer control it, and it came out in an explosion of rage completely out of proportion to the situation at hand. Some of us have tried to control communication by filling every silence, no matter how brief, with our own views. We were afraid to let others speak for fear of what they might say. We learned that we could keep ourselves safe, or we could be respectful of others, but we were unable to do both at the same time. In CoDA, we work the 12 steps in order to heal from the wounds of our past. No longer in the clutches of that pain, we are free to take a new, more loving and supportive approach to those around us. Our sponsor, our CoDA friends, and the CoDA literature all offer suggestions in the form of their own experience, strength, and hope. If it worked for them, maybe it will work for us. We apply some of these suggestions, and we develop new methods of communication based on the principles we learned in the 12 traditions. We begin to be able to risk intimacy, knowing that we can establish boundaries. And because there are boundaries, we can adjust them as necessary. It's an imperfect process of trial and error, but eventually we find that we've developed the capacity to communicate openly, honestly, and directly in a respectful way and without surrendering to abuse by another. So the questions I would pose is, what would it look like to be both safe and respectful at the same time? How do boundaries support intimacy? And what happens if we try to look after someone's feelings while we're setting a boundary? That we're going to have to move on to 9, which says, I acknowledge that I am a unique and precious creation. Low self-esteem is often the starting point for our codependents. Because we lack our own esteem, we seek esteem from others as we chase the esteem of others and get ever more desperate for someone else's recognition or approval. We engage in codependent patterns that further damage our self-esteem. Often we find ourselves in a downward cycle of approval seeking driven by low self-esteem that is aggravated by our approval seeking behaviors that are motivated by our low self-esteem, and so on. It's a vicious cycle. Our CoDA friends show us a different path. It starts when the members of our CoDA group treat us as valued members of the group. They see value in us, so we begin to suspect that we may have value. There's an old saying in recovery circles, if you want self-esteem, perform esteemable acts. In CoDA, we work the 12 steps and we try to practice the 12 traditions in all our affairs. We make amends where we have caused harm. We engage in acts of service, not for any reward, but because it's the loving thing to do. At first, we may show up early to the meeting to set up chairs because we're trying to earn our place in the group. Eventually, we do it simply because we feel good about ourselves when we do. Nobody else needs to see or be involved. Some of us prior to recovery felt odd or different. In CoDA, we begin to appreciate the value of being different. After all, the old timers tell us, if any two of us were identical, one of us would be unnecessary. We find that the principles we are practicing in the 12 steps and 12 traditions allow us to channel our unique character into productive and useful paths, and we begin to embrace our uniqueness. Eventually, we realize that we are both unique and precious. So, how does feeling odd or different feed into our codependence? How does your higher power see you? What's unique about you? What's precious about you? Promise 10. I no longer need to rely solely on others to provide my sense of worth. If I didn't have low self-esteem, I wouldn't have any QUIPS 1 CoDA member. In the past, we often had no sense of self-worth. Our behavior was dictated by a need for someone else's approval, and we adopted patterns of behavior that were harmful to ourselves and others. We couldn't be honest about our thoughts and feelings with others. What if they were the wrong thoughts and feelings? We couldn't set boundaries. What if someone else didn't like our boundaries? We couldn't look after our own needs. Someone else's needs were always more important. Often we bankrupted ourselves, emotionally and physically, if not financially, trying to buy someone else's approval and acceptance. In CoDA, we gradually build our self-esteem. Our progress through the 12 steps and our work in applying the 12 traditions contributes to a sense of self-worth that we may never have experienced before. We gain self-respect by practicing the principles of Tradition 4, autonomy, and Tradition 7, being self-supporting. We begin to realize that our opinion is just as important as someone else's, Tradition 2. Ultimately, we grow to realize that our opinion about ourselves and that of our higher power are the only ones that really matter. We can separate ourselves from the need for someone else's approval. We know that we are worthwhile and important just as we are. So what patterns of codependence do we engage in when we need someone else's approval? What changes in our behavior become possible when we no longer rely on others for our sense of worth? Which patterns of codependence have lost their hold? I often describe myself as my drug of choice is 5 minutes of someone else's approval. And you know, one of the patterns of codependence that always spoke to me is that codependents set aside or compromise their values and integrity to avoid rejection and other people's anger. Right? I have values. I know that it's wrong to lie and cheat and steal, but you know, if someone's approval is on the line, I become a liar, a thief, and a cheat, and I don't even think about it. Or if approval is off the table, now the most important thing is to avoid disapproval, and the same rules apply. And the only thing I want to know is, where can I hide the body? My values would go right out the window. So that's the pattern that speaks to me in this promise, and why this promise looms so large for me. I trust the guidance I receive from my higher power and come to believe in my own capabilities. If step 2 was a revelation for many of us, step 3 was a lifesaver. How long have we wandered through life rudderless and without direction? Lost, we latched onto others and made them our higher power. We became easy prey for abusers and manipulators. In step 2, we are introduced to a higher power of our own understanding. The only requirements on our own definition was that it be a loving higher power, Tradition 2, and greater than ourselves, step 2. Many of us were amazed at the idea that such a power could exist and would be there to provide guidance and strength when we needed it. In step 3, we were asked to make a decision to follow the guidance of that power to the best of our ability. Suddenly, our decisions were no longer determined solely by the self-interest of the imperfect people we obsessed over. We no longer turned our will and our lives over to the sickest person in the room. Instead, we tried to do the things that a wiser, kinder, more loving higher power wanted for our benefit. In time, our work through the rest of the steps helped us to become more consistent at hearing the guidance of our higher power and at following through on that guidance. Our decision-making and our choices became less frantic and more considered. We learned that my will is a constant urgency, God's will is a calm certainty, and we began to be able to tell the difference between the calm, quiet direction of our higher power and the strident demands of our codependence. As we became more consistent at pausing and consulting our higher power before taking action, we experienced more success. It became easier to trust our higher power, and our successes proved to us that we could walk through life with courage, integrity, and dignity. Promise 2. So, for those who've been around for a while and been doing this, have you noticed a change in your decision-making abilities or your process? You notice the change in your self-confidence. And for all of us, what would your life look like if you could consistently make every single decision in your life in alignment with the will of a higher power who loves you, wants the best for you, and is wiser and sees further than you do? Are we ready to get back to the work?
Yep, I think we're good.
Okay. So, so far what we've talked about is what do the promises kind of look like when they happen in our lives. And that's as far as most of us usually go with thinking about the promises, is we think of them, and I heard the word earlier, aspirational or affirmational. We can use them as affirmations, but or as milestones in our recovery. But we see them happen and realize that we've made progress. But beyond that, I would posit to you that they can also be used as hands-on tools in our recovery. We can use them moment to moment to actually be aids to our growth. So what's that look like? Well, it may mean reciting one of the promises in a tense moment as a reminder of the behavior we want to practice in our new recovery-based lives. We may use the recovery technique of acting as if. It might mean incorporating one or more of the promises into a prayer, seeking our higher power's support. Or we could use the principle described in one of the promises as a tool for decision-making when we are faced with a difficult choice. So for this, I have some examples for you. Should probably share that screen for you. So, for example, I can ask myself the question, what would a person of integrity and dignity do in this situation? Or I can remind myself, I am a unique and precious creation. I have value even if this person is angry with me. Or, higher power, please help me to communicate in a way that is safe for me and respectful of them. Or am I behaving like an equal partner in this situation? Or, I don't need this person's approval. I feel genuinely lovable, loving, and loved without them. Has anybody thought about using the promises in this way, as almost like the traditions, as guides to our behavior? So I'm going to add a couple of other ideas here before we carry on with the discussion. So we heard a lot earlier about becoming more consistent, about having slips, about progress, not perfection. Turning to the promises as guides for our behaviors helps to remind us to hold on to the gains that we've made in our recovery. Some of us like to say, you can't put the genie back in the lamp, or you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, or simply, you can't unknow something. What that means is that if we've experienced one of these promises even once, we're changed. Ours is a program of progress, not perfection. We may never grow to the point of experiencing all of these promises all of the time. But if we've experienced them even once, we now know that it's possible for us to behave in this new way. We can never go back to not knowing. Consider Promise 8. We may find ourselves in a tense situation communicating with a family member in a new way, one that is safe for us and yet still respectful of them. Exhilarated, this is my story, we phone our sponsor to report the new change in us. Does that mean we'll never engage in codependent communication with a family member again? Probably not. But in the future, when an opportunity arises to choose between our previous patterns and our new behavior, we will know that we have options. We gradually begin to exercise the other options. Slowly, perhaps, we become more consistent about practicing better behaviors. Some of us describe this as the 7th step, humbly ask God to remove our shortcomings at work in our lives. Going deeper, when we actively incorporate CoDA's promises into our daily thinking, we begin to experience them at a deeper level. They gradually become a part of everything we do. We begin to use them daily in an interrelated way. Now, I want to point out something, that a tool is not terribly useful if it's not within reach. And so one of the things we talk about is internalizing these promises. In my own case, in early recovery, the guy that I asked to be my sponsor used to read the steps or the traditions, but without reading them. He would just simply say them. And I thought that was just the coolest thing ever. So I tried to emulate him to the best of my ability, and got to the point where I had memorized the steps and the traditions. Then I realized something, that once I had that, I could carry them around within me, and I could internalize them, and they actually meant more to me. And the same holds true with these promises, that when we read them with feeling, they just mean more. When we dissect them into their individual pieces and be able to put them together in different ways, they just mean more. And so, for example, when we combine some of these promises, we can combine Promise 2 and Promise 5. Because I'm no longer controlled by my fears, I'm free to love and accept myself and others. Or I can combine Promise 3 and Promise 10. I know a new freedom, since I don't have to rely on anyone else for my sense of worth. Or Promise 4 plus Promise 2. I'm free of worry, guilt, and regret about my past, so I can act with courage, integrity, and dignity today. Think about that as you look at the list of promises. Where can you bridge from one to another in order to be able to use them today in your life? Anybody want to talk about that? So I need to make amends here, guys. In my getting flustered over my bathroom break, I completely missed Promise 12. And consequently, Jackie and I have had some discussion. We think that Promise 12 is going to be a great way to wind this up. I'm going to do that without opening up questions. I'll put the questions on the screen for you to think about if you like, but we're not going to have time to talk about them. And for that, I'm human. Promise 12, I gradually experienced serenity, strength, and spiritual growth in my daily life. It has been said that when we stop growing, we stagnate. Stagnation can be defined as dying very slowly. That's what many of us were doing before we came to Codependents Anonymous. When we honestly work the 12 steps and practice the 12 traditions, we change and grow. We can't help it. We don't even have to believe it will work when we start. It just happens. Our newly found relationship with a higher power equips us with a new source of guidance and strength. Our daily practice of step 11 brings us into closer contact with that higher power and relieves us of our fears. We begin to see glimmers of that peace of mind we call serenity. We begin to be able to take risks and experience successes. Our work in the 4-step inventory helps us to see the reality of our lives more clearly. Our work in service to CoDA helps us to learn patience and tolerance. Our inventory work and amends in steps 8 and 9 help to free us from guilt and shame over our past actions. All of these things contribute to our feelings of serenity. Carrying the message of CoDA to others in step 12 is often described as our greatest opportunity for spiritual growth. As we work with newcomers and sponsor others in CoDA, we cement our own relationship with the steps and with our higher power, and we grow. It doesn't happen overnight for most of us. Looking back through these promises, we're sometimes surprised at how many of them have become true for us. At other times, we are excited by how much more growth is in store for us. As it says in the CoDA Welcome, we've all learned to survive life, but in CoDA, we're learning to live life. Living is a process of growth. The 12 promises give us a measure that we can use to see that we are growing, that we are living. So I want to thank everybody for the privilege of being able to do this with you today.